Okay, recording now. Jem, if you want, you can already share your screen like you did before. That way we're already in the loop. And for a bit of context, guys, thanks for jumping on this video. So Jem and I have been talking for a while now about doing a little more in-depth talk on just NIRS data visualization and how to interpret it, how to look at it, how to read Moxy and NIRS data in general. And so we thought we'd do something a little bit different than the usual podcast format where it's a lot of talking and not a lot of visuals. And we're going to try and bring a few visuals into the picture. Jem prepared a few slides. And so the goal for today, if we can get that together, Jem, is to essentially go through the basics of NIRS and then have a look at some basic or some standard, let's say, assessments, 5-1 format, 4-1 format, and try to look at the data and see what we can actually read and understand from the data and extract from it, right?
Yeah, so we hopefully should be seeing the right thing now. It's a bit of a complicated process. I'm going to be trying to look at the camera, but also I'm going to be kind of drawing on the screen here. Oh, didn't even draw there. Hold on. Let's see.
Nobody will hold it against you if you look down at your tablet. Yeah, no, it's
there
good.
We go.
All right, go for it, man.
Yeah, well, okay, let's jump in. We can kind of start from some of the basics and review NIRS, near infrared spectroscopy as a system as it relates to sport, as it relates to kind of what we're interested in. Mm-hmm. So this is a good diagram that exists somewhere on the internet. I can't actually find the original source for where this picture comes from, but it's great. So basically we have our sensor. It's sitting on the skin. So it's completely non-invasive and it's shining light of specific wavelengths into the tissue. And we can see this is kind of representing our vascular bed, our capillary bed in the tissue. What it's doing is bouncing this light off of it scatters through the tissue medium. It's bouncing off all of the different little molecules and being absorbed specifically by two molecules that we're interested in. And those are hemoglobin, HB, and myoglobin, MB. Hemoglobin is in the blood. Hemoglobin is what's carried by red blood cells. It's the main carrier of oxygen. So it's going to be bound to oxygen. So we can have, when it's bound to oxygen, it's O2HB, and MB, myoglobin. Myo means muscle. So myoglobin is kind of an analogous molecule that binds to oxygen, that stores oxygen within the muscle tissue itself. So we kind of have our vascular carrier and our muscular, our local storage of oxygen.
Do we have an idea of the proportion of HB and MB?
No, that's a good question.
Yeah.
In the literature,
if we don't, we can move on from it. But it was just, I think some people have this question, so it was good to bring it in.
Totally. As far as I'm familiar with it, NIRS cannot differentiate between the two. There's other techniques that can, and the estimates go from 20%, 80% in one direction to 80%, 20% in the other direction. So it's really, I can't say, certainly the answer might be out there, but basically we just take it as a combination. And that is actually why we tend to call it just heme. That represents kind of the sum of both molecules. So we'll be I'll be trying to talk about heme, but you might see it. I think the Moxy nomenclature is HB or THB. So THB would just be total hemoglobin, but it's really implying that it would be total heme.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we'll mix and match some of the nomenclature here. So we have our two heme molecules within the tissue. The light is bounced, or it's actually absorbed by those two molecules, and then kind of the residual light is reflected back, or some of it is resolved by the sensor, and that gives us our NIRS signal. And so it's very simply the color of the light being reflected back will change depending on whether these heme molecules are oxygenated or deoxygenated.
But they have a different color, right? Is an easy way to kind of picture it.
Exactly. In our schematic here, it's red and blue. I don't think it's literally red and blue. It's 853 nanometers, but whatever. We can just kind of visualize it here. The important thing to realize is, and this image shows kind of a good example, the signal that we're getting snapshots. First of all, we're getting a kind of a single data sample. We're not getting a real-time flow. Of course, the sampling rate, I think the Moxy sampling rate is 0.5 hertz. So it's one sample every 2 seconds.
You can get that down to 2 hertz.
That's right.
There's
other devices that go up to 50 hertz. So
there's actually
the sampling rate is quite high.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off. I was talking to the Train Red folks who are coming out with a new NIRS device pretty soon. And the basic model is going to have a 10 hertz refresh rate, and then the advanced one is going to have 100 hertz.
Oh wow!
Which is, for research.
I think most of the literature
guess
that I've seen is about 10 hertz.
Okay.
There's very few applications. I've used systems that have 50 hertz, and we end up heavily filtering it back down to.
He was saying it's not Excel friendly.
Yeah, no,
you can't do anything with that data.
300,000 data points, kind of thing. Honestly, one sample every 2 seconds. When we're looking at a sport environment where we're concerned with minutes, potentially longer, we don't care about 1 second or a tenth of a second. It's
I think for the context of definitely for the context of this talk, we're going to stick with the endurance side of things. We're not going to talk about strength training and those more short-lived events, let's call them, or just measurements you can take with the device. We're going to stay on the longer stuff, just so we can have a common base, and we can do other videos later on the other parameters. But I think it's good to stay on the longer time frames for now, just for simplicity's sake, because it feels like the shorter it is, the more complicated it is. Yeah,
exactly. We'll try to stay on the first fractal level of this understanding.
Exactly.
The important thing to take away from this kind of image here, I think, is, again, so NIRS is a snapshot in time. It's not giving us any flow information through that system. It's just what is the volume of heme in the system. And so THB will call that, Moxy will call that THB, and I'm calling that total heme volume.
Yeah, and that's technically an arbitrary unit, where you don't want to judge the number itself, but you want to look at the trend of the curve.
Exactly. That number will change from sample to sample. Mm-hmm. The units by which it change is not meaningful, and I have an example. We can look at it later on. Mm-hmm. But just kind of the direction of change. Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Exactly. That's important takeaway. So we have this snapshot in time. We're looking at a volume of tissue. So NIRS is giving us a spatial average, right? We can see kind of the color changes on a gradient. So we're getting a spatial average of the tissue volume, as well as a temporal average over time between those samples. What is the change? Which direction has it gone, up or down? Which direction has the saturation gone? We'll see lots of this. This is the familiar measure, SMO2, muscle oxygen saturation. That's just simply a percent. So how much of that heme volume in the tissue is oxygenated, how much of it is deoxygenated. And let me go forward here. So this is just, again, right, a visual example. This is all we're doing, is we're shining a fancy light through the skin, and we're resolving some of the, we're resolving the microvasculature. So NIRS is only really looking at the vessels less than 1 millimeter. So the very small capillaries. That's a good thing, because that's where oxygen exchange takes place. So we're really seeing the system, the very local, hyperlocal system, where the metabolic activity is happening. So kind of where the fun part is happening. And then Andre Feldman, this is an analogy that I stole from him. It's a great analogy. And so it's kind of like this kind of, this represents our tissue medium. So this is our volume of heme, myoglobin and hemoglobin. Some of it's deoxygenated in blue, some of it's oxygenated in red. Some of the fancier sensors, like the $100,000 plus sensors, will be able to resolve each of these molecules individually, and we can actually count the absolute quantity of oxyheme.
That's insane.
It's crazy. I haven't used those systems. The more common technology, the picture looks something more like this, where we're not counting particular individual values, individual molecules. We're just kind of getting a hazy image of like, okay, yeah, we have this volume, and I don't know, let's call that 70% saturated. So our SMO2, our oxygen saturation, is 70% in this case. And so again, this is one sample. At the next sample, we can have two things that might change. That is the SMO2 may change, may go up or down. And of course, the heme volume may go up or down. And those are kind of related. So we have a bunch of different parameters of change here. And we're kind of just getting the average, getting the balance. So it's a very relative measure. It's a quantitative number that gives us a lot of information, but it's a relative measure of a lot of different systems happening behind the scenes. So that's certainly important. Why don't we kind of start with some actual real applied numbers, and we can look at this. That's beautifully
jumping right in. One thing I wanted to just add, maybe for people who are just starting to use the Moxy or don't haven't gone far into the technology yet. I think we're going to look at a lot of SMO2 trends today, and we're going to stick to a lot of that, maybe beyond the THB. We're maybe, I don't know what you've cooked up for us, but I don't know if we're touching on THB, but I think that it's important to understand that THB is influenced by at least 3 factors. Evan described that really well. One is the metabolic vasodilation. So functional sympatholysis, I guess, is just the ability of the body to respond to, well, I guess that's more in the sense of responding to the sympathetic vasoconstriction, which is number 2. So you got metabolic vasodilation, you got sympathetic vasoconstriction, and you got the mechanical compression of the muscles contracting. So all those 3 factors influence your THB signal, which is one of the reasons why I think, or from what I understand, THB is harder to read than SMO2 is. Would you say that's...
Yeah, I agree with that completely. That's exactly like
cool.
we do have a slide of THB somewhere, but yeah, we'll spend most of the time on SMO2. SMO2 gives us the most information from Moxy simply because we talked about this before, right? The values by which THB changes, it's like 0.1, 0.2 versus SMO2 goes from, we can see here almost 0% to 80%, call it. So just the magnitude of change is much higher.
Yeah.
So maybe let's kind of explain what are we looking at here for those who haven't seen it. So this is we would call it a 5-1, an intermittent step test, cycling test. 5-1 is probably familiar. I know you guys do the same or a similar protocol. It's basically referring to 5-minute work stages. So each of these gold boxes is our work stage, is our power output. Power output's just on the y-axis here, so we can see the numbers. And then each of those 5 minutes is separated, is intermittent with 1 minute rest.
Yeah. So
we have a work stage and a rest stage. Yeah, go
on. Yeah, I've been using 4-1 as a standard protocol for a while now. And so why is 5 minute a good time frame? Why is 4 to 5 minutes a good time frame? Maybe you can explain a bit more about that fast component, or that the time to equilibrium of systems, let's say, because I think that might be a good way to answer the why the 4 or 5 minutes.
Perfect. Hey, this is exactly what I wanted to get into, is basically we can split up each interval into 3 components. We have an onset component, which is kind of, we've just introduced the workload. That's our exercise stimulus. And we're going to have a period of accommodation where our system is trying to regain homeostasis, trying to regain a steady state to that new demand for energy, that new demand for oxygen. And so that usually takes kind of the first 60 to 120 seconds. And then we say on average, it's about 90 seconds.
Right.
And so we can kind of see it here, right? The first onset kinetics in this case would be kind of, we see this big dip and actually it comes back up and then it kind of stabilizes after that. So the first 90 seconds is our onset kinetics. Then we have a period of relative steady state where the body is kind of in a relative balance, depending on the intensity that we're working at, of course. And so that's kind of the remaining 2 minutes, 3 minutes, depending on the subject. So that's why we usually want an interval, at minimum, the literature suggests at minimum 3 minutes. And that comes from lactate testing. So kind of, lactate will stabilize. All of this stuff is stabilizing in about 2 minutes. And so, you want kind of as much of a steady state portion as you can get. So
because you have
5 minutes.
Yeah, I think because you have to control, you have to almost take out that first 2 minutes to be safe. And then you can look at whatever's left, because like you said, the onset kinetics of both the muscle. And then if you look at the other side, if you look at ventilation as well, you're also going to have that fast component. And then you're going to have that steady state, or maybe a slow component, depending on where you are on the spectrum. But either way, you have to wait essentially 2 minutes before you can see, let's say, delivery and utilization being somewhat into a balance.
Before they kind of reach a balance.
Exactly. And then you can actually get some information from there. Right.
So that's why 3, 4, 5 minutes, longer is better. Inigo San Milan, I think, goes 10 minutes for his lactate testing. So longer is better. But of course, we're going to run into time constraints. You can see this test already is an hour, but we're actually starting at 20 minutes. So it's about a 40-minute test. It's quite long.
And it's still, I think, depending on the level of the athlete, I would wager that with a higher level athlete, endurance athlete, if you're with a cyclist or with a runner, you could afford to do the longer steps. But if you put a beginner, quote unquote, and you try to put them through 5 minutes, even like the first 30 minutes is going to kill them, even if it's at a fairly low intensity. So I think one thing to be mindful as well when picking the time of the steps that you use, I guess.
Yeah, it's a fine balance, and it definitely depends on the subject. So you really have to kind of cater that to the individual. let me put it kind of in a systematic way to think about it. We're interested in what does the oxygenation look like? What does SMO2 in this case look like in an intensity or a workload dependent manner? So what does the workload as a stimulus produce in terms of SMO2 as a response? And so a test like this, we have workload is increasing linearly, and we have to have some period of time where that workload, that same constant workload, is applied to see where the SMO2 kind of, balances out. Let's say it kind of balances there, and then we increase to the next stage and perform the same thing. But this is the intensity component, but of course we have kind of a durational component as well. And that's what you're touching on, is we have durational fatigue, I'll say, just accumulating, ramping up as we go. So the longer we go, the more things are not just changing in an intensity dependent manner, but they're changing with a durational dependent manner as well. So that's okay. And we prefer to have a long assessment, because the reality is, cycling especially is a durationally dependent sport.
Exactly.
And so we want to see what is your maximal capacity, for example, at the end of an hour's assessment. That might not necessarily always be your intention, depending on what the athlete's events are, what their goals are. So as you say, it's a very fine balance. So within each 5-minute work stage, like I said, we're looking at kind of 3 components. We're looking at the onset kinetics, the first 90 seconds, 120 seconds. We're looking at the steady state portion of work. And then of course, as we remove that workload, we go into the 1-minute rest. That gives us reoxygenation kinetics. So we have this kind of 3 phases of each interval. And again, so we have kind of 3 phases. We can pick out certain parameters from each of those phases to give us information about what the body's response is to that stimulus, to that particular exercise workload. So just kind of looking at this subject at a 30,000 foot view, we can see some trends. We can see kind of the work values tend to decrease kind of linearly, almost linearly. We can see the recoveries get a little bit higher. And of course, then we have this kind of expanding profile, this dynamic range, or this amplitude between min and max increases, of course, as intensity increases. And so here's where we kind of have to get into a little bit more detail and decide, okay, what are the relevant parameters? What are we actually interested to look at? So I think we can talk about four different kind of basic parameters, and all of these are visually identifiable. So we don't have to do any further analysis. So you get your Moxy data, plug it into Excel, put it into a chart, and you get something like the blue line here. And we need not do any additional analysis. We can kind of look at certain parameters. I should actually mention, so we're looking at the VL, by the way. That's our blue line. We're looking at the right vastus lateralis.
On a cyclist, right?
Cycling, of course. Yeah, exactly. Now let's introduce another one. Let's actually look at 2 side by side. So I hope this is still big enough that everyone can kind of see what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's good.
We have our subject 12 and our subject 17. And I went through our data set and tried to pick out 2 subjects that showed very different trends, very different profiles. And these are perfect. You can see already kind of there's some big differences between these subjects. Last time we chatted, I mentioned like VL. I said, I think I said VL was the least interesting muscle to look at, something like that. and subject 12, this is an example where that is kind of the case. And, like I said, it's almost just a linear drop. There's on first glance, it's hard to kind of say, okay, what information are we getting from that? Are we just saying as power output increases, SMO2 decreases? Like, what does that give us? Subject 17, on the other hand, obviously is a different profile. I would say a more interesting profile, where we have this curvilinear shape. Whoops, missed that, curvilinear. And so maybe we can kind of draw some, okay, well, what does it mean when she's kind of at her peak here versus at the minimum? So there's a bit more interesting stuff going on.
Was there a big difference in levels between the 2 athletes?
No. And that's why I chose them, because look, they both reach approximately 4 watts per kilo in the last step. And I don't remember offhand what their VO2 max were, but honestly, we're more interested in what their power output is, their maximal aerobic power. And it was very much the same. So I thought these are 2 good comparisons. Fitness wise, they're approximately matched. Again, they happen to be male and female. So subject 12 is male, subject 17 is female, but I wouldn't say these trends represent, or they're not exclusive to sex differences, right? No. They just happen to be the case. If anything, I'm going to say subject 7, this is kind of a more, let's call it an aerobic profile, where there's this, we'll get into this more in detail, but right, we have like an increase, a reoxygenation, a big increase in oxygenation, which means there must be some surplus of delivery, of oxygen delivery coming in, which is a great thing. So that's kind of a more aerobic, more delivery phenotype. And then subject 12 is, I'm going to say, an extraction phenotype. He kind of just keeps extracting as much as he can, drives the VL down to 0, and then that's it. And that's all he has. Would
that have anything to do with phenotype from a Tiber fight perspective, fiber type perspective?
Yeah, very possibly.
Do you have any of those data on those subjects, or was that not part of?
Oh no, we don't have it. We don't. Unfortunately, no, we don't have any biopsy or fiber type. That's coming. That's in 2022. Nice. Certainly, yeah. Fiber type makes a big difference. Yeah. I like to say, like, let's consider just more general tissue composition. So if let's go back to our tissue medium here. We're on the skin, we're looking through the skin, we're looking through the superficial layers, and we're getting a little bit of the muscle underneath. And we're only going down, what does Moxy go down? 2 centimeters, I think, of depth, something like that. I might be wrong.
I think that's about it. And it can only tolerate, I think the upper boundary for adipose tissue is 1.5 centimeter.
Exactly. And that's where I'm getting at. So we have kind of our skin layers, we have some adipose, some subcutaneous fat layers, and then we have our muscle. And obviously the muscle is far more metabolically active. So that's what we're interested in. That's where we want to see this oxygenation, deoxygenation. But the other tissues, so that tissue composition makes a big difference on the signal. Then we get to the muscle layer itself, where that's more of that fiber type, fast twitch, slow twitch. Very simply, where on the muscle are we placing our sensor, and what is the tissue, what is the muscle composition that happens to be under that sensor? So like I said, it's very hyper local. So theoretically, for example, if we go back to these guys, it could just so happen that if we move the sensor on subject 12 by a centimeter up or down, that will change the apparent phenotype and it will look more aerobic. So it's very individual. You have to be very consistent with where the sensor is placed. There's lots of good guidelines that Moxy has, that other resources out there. I think we talked about that last time, where
on the Moxy YouTube channel has a good video on sensor placement. I would definitely say that the presentation of subject 12 is something that something that I see more in more heavily muscled athletes. You take like big male CrossFit athletes that have a lot of muscle on them, and their VL is usually going to look like this on a bike. And
I'd agree.
That's usually what shows up in general.
Yeah. Again, these kind of, they happen to be male and female. It's not exclusively male or female. I've seen the reverse, but if we're making general statements, again, this tends to be more lean, muscular men will look something like this, more aerobic phenotype. Women tend to be more aerobic in general, especially peripherally. Women are more aerobically dominant. Yeah. So you do see that kind of trend more often, but I just want to, it's not exclusive to sex differences. So anyway, we're looking at 2 different subjects, which show some interesting trends. So the parameters that we want to look at, I guess we can start by looking at the onset kinetics. We've already talked about that a little bit. And again, without doing any kind of analysis, we can just look visually and see where these onset kinetics are changing. So let's start with subject 17. This athlete, we always see this as kind of initial deoxygenation. So as we introduce that workload, we impose a sudden demand for energy, a sudden demand for oxygen, and we get an oxygen or a deoxygenation, and that's our drop. And then the kinetics are, we have this balance of oxygen delivery and oxygen extraction. So the balance is oxygen delivery will then increase to try to match that new stimulus, that new demand. And in this case, in these early stages, we can actually see this subject is getting a big, an exercise hyperemia, an increase in oxygen delivery in excess of what they're extracting. And so the SMO2, the net SMO2 increases in actually both of these cases.
Yeah, so delivery is higher than utilization in that upward trend portion is one of the things we want to be looking at is the trend of the curve after that onset. has happened. So if you take out, like we said before, that 90 to 120 seconds, and then you look at the shape of the trend, where is it going? Is it going up? Is it flat? Or is it going down? And also compare it relative to what's on its left and what's on its right. That starts to give you quite a bit of information about where you find yourself on the intensity spectrum for that person.
Right. So we can start just with that onset kinetics and say, okay, we're getting this increased delivery. And then we start to look at some of these middle stages. We get this more complex shape, right? This it's kind of deoxygenating, it's coming back up, and then it's reaching a balance. And that's what we see over here on subject 12 as well. And so in these stages, this onset kinetics, my interpretation of these kinetics, and let me back up and just say, when I say my interpretation, this is based on learning from a lot of other smart people. So, when I have a good idea, it's not my idea, it's someone else's idea. When I have a bad idea, it's because I've misunderstood and it's my own fault. So it's a good
way to put it. We both, I think it is important to say that we both stand on shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
And just because all the names are not mentioned does not mean that we don't respect what they've done or just, take note of where it all comes from. We, like you said, we didn't invent any of this. We just fell on the information by chance.
Long history of very smart people.
Exactly. So yeah, that's worth noting.
So this kind of the more complex kinetics in these middle stages, I think is very interesting. My interpretation here is, so that's a delayed delivery kinetics. So what we're seeing is this kind of this deoxygenation before delivery can get on top of the effort, before it can really match that effort. So it's taking a little while for the delivery to come in. Then we see this uptick, and then it kind of plateaus. It finds the right balance. So when we see this kind of this little again this complex onset kinetics behavior, that could imply that there's a delay kinetics. I've actually seen, sometimes you won't have that trend at all, and it'll just be down and flat, like we see in some of these later stages. I've seen this kind of kinetics quite often when someone's fatigued, when an athlete is fatigued. They come in, I did a hard workout yesterday. Well, we asked you not to, and there's a reason, because now we're just going to see the fatigue and we're not going to see what your actual capabilities are. Doesn't necessarily mean fatigue. Again, lower fitness novice athletes might show that delay just simply because their kinetics of oxygen delivery are slower, are less than a highly fit, highly trained subject. So that's where we're kind of looking for fitness traits and or fatigue states, both of those kind of things. And then, like I said, as we get to some higher intensity, we start to see the balance kind of it's almost a more smooth trend. We see it in this subject over here as well. And in this case, we have this initial deoxygenation. Oxygen delivery is still trying to increase. It's trying to balance, but especially over here, you can see this downward trend. It can't match it. So we still have a gap. We have a mismatch where, in this case, if oxygen delivery is less than oxygen uptake, if oxygen uptake is greater, we're going to see SMO2 decline. So we can see SMO2 inclines. That means delivery is greater than uptake. Oxygen declines. That means delivery is less than uptake. So that's another system of processes that were balances. We've got a spatial balance, a temporal balance, and a balance of delivery and uptake. It's simple. Lots going on.
So far, so good.
Yeah. Okay, so that's our onset kinetics. We can see some trends there, and let's move on to the work slope. We've kind of talked about that a bit. So again, very easy to see in this subject here. We can see kind of upward slope. Let's call that flat, and then we see more downward slopes, and that's what we just talked about, the mismatch between delivery and uptake. So in this example, maybe let's remember kind of what we're doing here is, are we trying to find breakpoints? Are we just kind of describing what their intensity dependent relationship is of oxygenation? If we're trying to find breakpoints, maybe we start to draw them there and we say, okay, well, we've got an up slope and an up slope and then a flat and down slope. So that's maybe a preliminary guess of where our thresholds may be. What about subject 12 here? If we kind of look at this, I don't know, there's not much happening there in terms of the slope. So this is what I was talking about, where, it's kind of not a lot of interesting information in this particular leg of this subject at the VL muscle. So slope in this case,
it's not giving us much. Yeah. Would you would you be comfortable saying anything about thresholds on that leg versus or subject 12 versus subject 17? Could you still pick it out? I mean, from
based on the slope.
No, not based on the slope.
That's why we have other parameters.
For me, would it be also based on the relative difference in the absolute numbers between steps? Is that where you were going?
Exactly. Yeah,
okay,
that's the next thing. So we're kind of looking at the slope, and the slope is just independent of the value of the magnitude. But of course, the value, what actual SMO2 value are they at? So we can say, let's use the last 30 seconds or so, and we'll call it a mean. But again, we're just looking at this visually, so we can kind of draw some dots here, and we can see, well, certainly there's a bit of a plateau in the last couple stages, and there's not much change actually in the first couple stages. So it is kind of this S shape approximately kind of thing. So there's no distinct drop, but what I would look at would be where is there kind of a phase change, or where is it more different looking one direction and looking the other direction? So for example, well, these two stages, right? These two stages are more similar than these two stages in terms of that drop. Not by much though, it's hard to say. It looks like kind of the steepest downward section is maybe kind of in here, and then certainly it plateaus between there. I wouldn't say, oh, that means there's a breakpoint there. It's because they're bottomed out, right? They're at maximum deoxygenation. So I don't think that's a breakpoint. I think that's like a maximum capacity. So it's hard to say, but maybe we would draw it. Oh, if that's our steep section, maybe we would draw it there. But even just by looking at the value on this subject, I don't know. Have a hard time.
It is hard. I would probably put the first one, like you say, it's hard, between 1.5 and 2 watts per kilo, maybe, and then the second one between 3 and 3.5. But and that's, I think, where one of the limitations of NIRS is that it's one data point, and sometimes it's kind of a classic case like you have on the right, and it's super easy to extract information. Sometimes it's like the left, and you could infer some stuff and try to put some lines, but you might be wrong. And that's where additional data, whether it's HRV, whether it's gas exchange data, all that stuff comes in, and now you can triangulate and say, well, I look at the leg, it tells me this. I look at the breathing, it tells me this. I look at the heart, it tells me this. I look at the RPE, it tells me this. And now I decide, where do I play, and maybe even lactate if you have that on top of everything, and now you can have a pretty solid, as we did. And for those who haven't watched it yet, go check out the podcast we did with Jem and Andrew on thresholds. We talked about thresholds for an hour and a half. If you want the short version, they don't exist. And but it's a good exactly. But it's still a good way. It's a good way of framing things to simplify our life as mere humans and mere mortals with our tiny little brains. So it's a useful heuristic, let's say, to be used. And again, I think that case on the left really shows how SMO2 is sometimes not enough to draw conclusions.
Again, we're integrating multiple parameters from each signal. The more signals, i.e. the more muscle sites that we're measuring, the more information we're getting about the systemic performance level. And then we have other measures we're looking at, as you said, lactate, ventilation, everything else. Let me that threshold point, that's a very good point. Let me just kind of, so sorry, I should have left these up. Where did you say? Somewhere
I think I said like one before, but I would have said between 1.5.
It's tough to tell anyway, but the point is, so there are certainly intensity domains. There is an intensity, a workload at which you are in one domain, and a workload at which the physiological response is very different. So we know there's different domains. It's the point at which it transitions from one to the other that's difficult to nail down. But do we really need to nail that down? Again, if we say, okay, well, this subject is kind of somewhere through here, let's just make sure that when we want them to be working easy, they're working easy. They're working, somewhere in these bottom two stages. And I'll say, right, oxygenation or the aerobic zone 2, zone 1, whatever we want to call it, is we're finding is typically lower than we think. You don't have to go very hard. But just make sure you're kind of somewhere in the middle of the zone. And that's kind of all that matters, right? You don't need to be at 102% of FTP or 102%, just make sure you're in the middle. If you're really pushing on where that transition boundary is, that's where we get into, first of all, that boundary, that break point is going to shift with duration. So maybe, maybe you start at 98% spot on for the first 10 minutes, but 20 minutes later, well, now you're at 102 because the boundary has shifted.
It'll shift with environment too. It'll shift with fatigue. It'll shift with, like you said, many things. So having an idea of whereabouts it is, and then using the state of the day and maybe other monitoring tool, whether it's just breathing. Are you, at ease with your breathing, or are you starting to? Exactly. So this is the sensations. There's going to be HRV to some extent that is used more and more now, to especially to stay under that first threshold, and look at DFA and some other stuff. But like you said, it's good to know whereabouts they are, maybe not exactly where they are, and then work from there.
Okay, so we looked at the onset kinetics. We looked at the kind of the work slope and the work values. And now what do we have left? We have the recovery kinetics. So that's our big kind of spikes here. The first thing that we can look at, again, just visually, we're not doing any extra analysis. The first thing we can look at is, where do these reoxygenation spikes, how high do they get? They get about there. We can draw lines through this guy here.
Yeah, that's one I still haven't had a straight answer from anybody on. I'm
not going to give you a straight answer today.
No, but I'm still going to ask you.
Yep.
So do what you can with it. But what influences your maximum SMO2 recovery value? What is it the muscle? Is it the heart? Is it the breathing? Is it a combination of those? Which one's more? What's your best take on that?
Yes. The peak, the reoxygenation process. So again, kind of framing what we're looking at. We've just taken away the exercise stimulus. We're at a nice balance. We're at a nice homeostasis. Delivery is matching to extraction. And then all of a sudden, we take away the demand for energy, the demand for oxygen. So our extraction rapidly falls. Our delivery is, we have this residual leftover delivery. So extraction falls quite quickly, delivery remains high. And so now we have a mismatch, and that gives us this very sharp reoxygenation, right? So delivery is in excess, delivery is greater than uptake during recovery. Of course, that kind of makes sense. So again, we see this interaction of the two processes. We could look at either the value of where these peaks are, or we could look at the amplitude of change from wherever we were during work to wherever we end up during rest. And honestly, I don't know which is more relevant, but both of them, right? So the reoxygenation in general is going to be proportional to delivery, very hand wavy to delivery. And maybe to get more specific, what does that mean? I would suggest that the major thing is going to be vasodilation, or we've talked about this, right? The responsiveness, the ability of the capillaries and the arterioles, the vascular system essentially that we're investigating with NIRS, the ability of it to expand, to dilate, and to respond to the exercise stimulus. So we've established what the exercise stimulus is. Our vascular system has responded to match it. And now we take that extraction away, and we're kind of left with, okay, where's our whole vascular system? So it's kind of this microvascular responsiveness, this vasodilatory capacity. Again, that doesn't tell us about flow. Flow is a velocity through the system. Let me go back to this diagram here, right? So we have flow is our velocity through the system. We're not getting information about that, but we are getting information about the vasodilation, the capacity of all of these microvessels. And those two things are going to be related, right? So I don't remember what the law is, but pressure, flow, and volume are all interrelated. And if you change one, the others are going to change as well. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with the recovery is we are changing, where are we? Sorry, again, we go back. We're changing pressure. I think you mentioned it before, right? So as we stop exercising, we remove that contraction, that intramuscular pressure. So the intramuscular pressure goes away. So there's big pressure fluctuation. That's going to change the flow coming in and the volume coming in. So we get a stimulus just very simply from that mechanical effect. Of course, we have the metabolic effect. We have the workload that has stimulated vasodilation through metabolites. I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole on that one. So we have mechanical, we have metabolic effects. What else? We have the muscle pump, effect as well. So it's kind of another mechanical effect, but we've gone from pedaling, which, if we know, every muscle contraction in our legs especially helps to supply blood flow, venous blood flow back up to the heart. That is obviously a closed system. So the more venous outflow we have from our muscles, from our legs, that's going to allow our hearts to expand, to get filled with more blood and to push more blood back into the arterial system and back towards our legs. So there's this whole flow loop that we've just interrupted by removing the muscle pump. And then, as you say, we have all of the neural and hormonal effects with kind of the autonomic reflexes, which you were talking about with functional sympatholysis. So we have vasodilation locally that is elicited by the tissues, and then we have this kind of neural systemic vasoconstriction, and those are competing.
What would you say?
Changes.
Maybe to give some practical takeaways, if you saw the subject 12, but you saw a downward trend of his maximum SMO2 value, or even maybe not a downward trend of the delta between the workload and the recovery, but definitely a downward slope with those red points. What could you draw anything from that? Could you say, oh, he's missing XYZ, or there's an issue with XYZ?
It's tough. I'm giving a lot of the kind of this systematic background, because I think that's important to understand, because these answers are not conclusive. As you said, we're kind of speculating here. But I think in that case, remember, we are clamped. Our time component, our time is clamped at 60 seconds. So we have 60 seconds to observe the recovery, and then we're imposing another workload. And that obviously we're going to see that the new onset kinetics, the deoxygenation. So our recovery kinetics are clamped to 60 seconds. In fact, we're going to go deep here. We're going to zoom in. Okay. Let's just look at one interval at a time. So this is one interval. We can see the recovery recovery kinetics. We're clamped here at 60 seconds. So in this example, we're at 3 watts per kilo. So, intermediate intensity. In this example, subject 12, we're still on subject 12. He reaches his peak somewhere here at 50 seconds. So he reaches a peak. He's got a full oxygenation response, and then it comes back down for the last few seconds. When we see subjects, I'm skipping around here a lot, I'm sorry, but it's happening. When we see subjects where, as you said, where maybe there's a profile like that in terms of the peaks, where the peaks are declining, I think what that is probably most related to is their kinetics just need more than 60 seconds to recover from that stimulus, right? So what if they
actually reach a peak and stabilize
in the middle of the recovery and stabilize there?
Yes.
Oh,
because I've seen that a few times.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So again, if we think about what are the components that we're looking at delivery and uptake.
It would be inability to resaturate fully or to a large extent. But if you assume that the work has stopped, you're not bringing enough O2 proportionally to all the blood you're bringing. So I guess you could go heme. So you could go, inability to load the hemoglobin. You could go pulmonary, maybe, where again you have a difficulty loading at the lung. Maybe that's I don't know if that.
Honestly, I mean that's a good point. I haven't even been thinking about up the chain,
right, exactly,
further up centrally in terms of the systematic. Absolutely, it could be a limitation up there. Locally, if we're seeing this kind of profile and it's not related to that time constraint that I implied, if it's a kind of a true what do you call it, expanding contracting amplitude here, my guess would be that's again, I'm thinking first locally, because that's where we're measuring is the local tissue. My first thought would be there's some limitation with, again, the capacity to deliver, and let's call that, vasodilatory capacity or flow capacity, compared to all of the counteracting forces. So that's intramuscular pressure, that's loss of venous outflow, that's uptake as well, right? So a continued metabolic uptake. So, if we just consider what the local constraints are, the global view would just to say, again, they have insufficient delivery to supply to fully respond to that effort that they've just imposed by their extraction. If we look further up the chain systematically, then we can get into a situation of is it central flow, or is it central oxygen content, which is kind of what you're talking about in terms of.
But then you would have you couldn't draw any conclusions, or you couldn't talk conclusively about those. You would have to go investigate. You would maybe do some blood sampling
elsewhere,
or so you'd have to measure that. But then you maybe need some blood samples if you want to look at iron deficiency or something like that. But with that maybe goes a little farther. But I see what you mean. So essentially, if you would see that, you would just say more zone 2.
Potentially.
If the vasodilator capacity was at hand, I mean, that's one of the ways that you're going to be able to address that, is just more time under quote unquote load, at a moderate load, that said, but still load, right?
Zone 2 is kind of where you build your angiogenesis, your capillarization. That's where you get a lot of that local blood flow, right? So HIT is for central, more or less. Well, in terms of blood flow, HIT also does mitochondria, which is peripheral. But in terms of peripheral blood flow, a lot of that is done in the zone 2. It's very important. Do your zone 2, do your aerobic work. So that's a tough question. I'm not sure if I have a good answer for that.
I asked it on purpose because it comes back quite often. So I think it's important for folks to see that it's still unclear exactly what it means, and that we can't draw any hard, fast conclusions about that data point in particular, or that shape or that trend in particular.
That's why I've left kind of this up here, right? It all comes down to delivery and uptake, and it's just the balance of those two. But we want to know what is causing there to be an imbalance there, and that's where it's very tough to answer, just because these signals are coming from a whole bunch of different factors. So if we know something more about the subject, if we have other measures, if we have ventilation, if we have blood lactate, if we have even EMG, for example, if we wanted to look at the muscle contraction and tell what the intramuscular pressures are, all of that. Why don't we actually look at?
Jem, I wanted to do 5 more minutes, and then so let me know what you had on your mind to go with, and then we can keep if that's okay with you, keep the remainder for a follow up call.
Should we? Let's look at the running example then.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Why don't we take a look at that? I have the charts that you sent me, unless you have anything new.
I've put the, if you have them, if and you want to draw on them, go ahead. Perfect. Here you go.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Let me pull up. I remember. So you sent me these 2 subjects.
Mm-hmm. So for context, there's 2 runners. The top guy is 1,500 to 3,000 meter, who should maybe even go a little bit longer in distance. So 3,000 meter steeple specialist, steeplechase. And the bottom one is a 4,800 meter specialist. Both national level runners here in Switzerland from a local team. Thank you, Max, for coming to test your team. And what we did is a kind of a hybrid protocol where we did 4-1 all the way through until we clearly passed the first threshold. And then for those guys, we went all the way to 15 kilometers per hour, where we did a last 4-1. And then we did a continuous ramp starting at 16 kilometers per hour onwards, of half a kilometer per hour per minute until volitional failure. And so it was interesting. I guess I'll let you talk on what you see, but essentially I sent you those because I'd done the test with those 2 guys, and you could really see some market differences at the lower and higher intensities, and also related to probably their profile and what they're best at, and what that says. So I'll let you take it away. It's an interesting one.
Oh, it's perfect. And you know, I responded. We had just been, or I'd been looking at some data that looks very similar to this. So it was perfect.
Yes.
It was kind of, we were all in the right mindset here. Really cool test. The first thing to note is, so we're looking at running, obviously different exercise modality. So the trends should look different, and indeed they do. The other thing is we're looking at, oh, where's my pen? There we go. We're looking at rectus femoris, different muscle than cycling. We were just looking at the VL in cycling. That's on the side, the outside of the thigh. Rectus femoris is right in the middle of the thigh. So it's rectus femoris. RF is the primary locomotor muscle, I would say, in running. Different trends though here, different trends. So first of all, we can kind of look at the two, and you sent me this, you know, asking, okay, which is the endurance guy, which is the speed guy? And there's not much difference between the two, but you know, different phenotypes can produce similar performances, and that's a great thing. And that's what we're seeing here, is we're finding some of the nuance that isn't maybe potentially explained by VO2 max or even by running economy, but it can be seen in the peripheral oxygenation. So, you know, I kind of had to look at these two without any data on them and decide which was which. And I think I got it right. Didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
Okay, yeah. You know, so I kind of talk through a rationale. The first thing I look at these, I see, you know, the top athlete is a little bit higher just on average. So they're a bit upshifted. And again, that's related primarily, the first explanatory factor for that is just tissue composition, I think. So skin, fat layers, then we get to muscle fiber type composition. So maybe that's meaningful, maybe it's not, but you know, it's one factor where a more aerobic phenotype will tend to be a little bit higher because of fiber type and possibly even because of fat tissue. But you said, right, these are two super lean athletes, so I don't think there's much.
Yeah, and beyond, and maybe beyond
tissue.
the absolute number, you can also look at maybe the bandwidth of between max and min during that time, and you clearly see on the bottom one that he recovers to 80% on his peaks. But he goes down to about 40, let's say 40% at the lowest on the latest 401 work stages, where the top one you can clearly see is easily over 60, maybe even over 70 for most of it, at least on the right leg. And so you have the amplitude is much lower and much higher as well.
That's right. That's what I'm looking at. So I'm looking at kind of the values, the average values, the slope, and we're looking at this whole global slope through each work phase. And you can see the bottom athlete is a little bit more of a negative slope. So even though they're ostensibly at the same relative intensity, right? Blood lactate, that's a systemic measure of intensity, approximation of intensity, I should say. Even though that's the same, we can see the muscles are responding differently. There's a little bit more disruption, let's say, to the metabolic milieu in the bottom athlete than the top. So there's a little bit less ability to match, to stabilize, to find a steady state. And then, as you say, the amplitudes between the dips and then the reoxygenation during recovery, those amplitudes are a little bit higher at the bottom. So again, my interpretation of that would be the stimulus is greater, right? The body is having to work a little bit harder to match whatever the stimulus is here, right? It's reoxygenating higher because, again, that stimulus has prompted it to have to increase delivery to a greater extent. So we're still submaximal, but it's more of a disruption.
Maybe as a hypothesis, I would even go as far as saying that it's the load is the same, but what the body is made of is functioning slightly differently. If we're talking type 1, type 2 as a simple distinction, and
the external load is the same. The internal load is
exactly, because what you're using to produce the force, to produce the work and again, I don't have any fiber type data on those athletes, but given their profiles and how those look, you can start to get a picture. But essentially, more type 2, they're going to use more oxygen proportionally. They're going to be less oxygen efficient in how they use that oxygen, and so potentially that's why you might see some lower values all the way through, just a little bit like we saw in the in your subject 17 and 12, I think it was before, between
very similar.
Yeah, exactly.
The other point, you touched on this, is kind of the metabolic substrate utilization, or the metabolic shift that we're seeing. And that's what I hope I mentioned it before, but I also think that's what's contributing to this, right? We see this familiar kind of deoxygenation plateau. We see that more so in the bottom subject during these first couple stages, or the middle stages, I should say. We don't see too much of that, at least in the purple line. We see that a bit in the blue line here, but we see less of that in the top athlete. So once again, my interpretation of that is that the onset kinetics of delivery are faster in our top athlete here, and they're a little bit slower in the bottom athlete. So again, just another piece of evidence that's pointing in one direction or another.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that.
What was the final?
There was also looking at the slope of the end, the slope.
Yeah, exactly.
Once we pass the interesting thing as well, since they're accomplished runners, we had quite a bit of running data on them, so I was able to calculate a critical speed, critical velocity for them. And on the legs, you could see it, but not as, and I think we'll probably use another video to talk about non-involved muscles, but it was so clear the break point on the forearm that we used on those guys. The break point on the forearm was within half a kilometer per hour, within half a kilometer per hour of their estimated critical speed. And you saw the clear break point between a somewhat downward trend, but then it would steepen quickly. You see that a little bit on those guys. It's not as clear, but I'll pull up the next time when we talk about non-involved muscles. I'll pull up the forearms of those guys. But I think the general slope, you could definitely see what I would say is the top guy, he stays flat, and then all the way down.
Yep.
And then the other one, he's already quite low. And then the slope at the end slope is not as acute as the top one, I would say. And that's again, maybe the top one, he's good, he's not. And then the second one, he's just bearing more load all the way through, and then obviously reaches failure at some point. But they're just again, the internal load is quite different in the way that it's I guess portrayed by those lines.
Yeah. What interested me was the top subject here. So they're both at 4 millimoles when they start the ramp, but the top athlete looks like he's preserving that oxygenation quite well for a first.
Sorry to cut you off. We're assuming I don't have any lactate data on those guys. So
right. Sorry, that was the test that I did. Yeah.
We're between. We're above 2. Okay. But again, it's
framed more on where the critical speed was.
We're in the heavy domain. We're kind of midway through the heavy domain, and we're about to go into severe, and that's where we see the break point. I think the top guy crossed over at around 18 and a half, if I'm not mistaken. 18 and a half, 19.
Exactly right. Somewhere in there.
Yeah. And then the bottom one was a little bit lower. I think it was 17 and a half or 18.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Somewhere in there.
So just as you say, right, the ability of this athlete to sustain oxygenation at a very high level. What are they at? They're at 70% approximately there versus 45 in the bottom athlete. Their ability to sustain that for so long. And you can tell, right? So they're both highly fit athletes. They both have a large capacity to extract oxygen. So they're both going to get to a pretty low minimum here. But the more aerobic athlete kind of keeps it high as long as possible and then dives. And the bottom subject, it's a little bit more, it's like kind of a slow decline, right? So they have a little bit of a mismatch the entire time, and they're just slowly kind of trickling that energy reserve out. So really cool comparison. The other thing that I looked at, and next time we'll have to see what the recovery, like give them a 2-minute recovery interval or something afterwards. Because if we just look at the inclines there, we're just getting a hint of what their reoxygenation, their reperfusion capacity is. And again, it looks like it's steeper in the top subject here. So potentially as well, right? They have this faster reoxygenation responses, greater vasodilatory or greater delivery capacity at that end stage. So really cool to see these two subjects. So the work that I was looking at the analysis. I didn't run any testing. I haven't done much testing on runners, but we were looking at a very similar protocol and same kind of thing. We were looking at 2 different athletes, different phenotypes. I think it was the same thing, like a 400, 800 meter specialist and a 15 5K specialist. So very similar. The tests that they had done were clamped on blood lactate. So that's why I got these confused. So for the test they did, they basically reached 4 millimoles and then started the ramp.
Okay.
I can't show these data because they're not my data to share, but I can talk about it. The speed athlete performed, they reached 4 millimoles earlier. They reached 4 millimoles, after whatever it was, 4 steps versus the endurance athletes 5 steps. But then they sustained the ramp for longer because now they're starting from a lower speed. They're starting the ramp from a lower speed. So they maintained their ramp longer. The speed athlete maintained it shorter, and they actually reached a pretty close end speed, maximum speed. So like the duration of the test was very similar between the two subjects. That was by design, but the way they got there was very, very different. So it was really cool to see the different phenotype that, I was just told about. I didn't know these athletes, but then being able to see those signals in the oxygenation data. And again, I'm constantly surprised that by simply looking at one muscle, yes, it's the primary locomotor muscle, but we're still only looking at one muscle, and running and cycling are fairly whole body activities. There's a lot of stuff going on, but by looking at one muscle and picking out some of these interesting parameters, we can get an estimation of their total overall metabolic intensity. I think that's constantly fascinating. But the other side of that is how much heterogeneity, how much variability there are even within a single athlete, never mind between athletes, never mind between fitness levels, between sports, all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot to digest, but hopefully as we go piece by piece, as we've been doing, we can start to build a bit of a picture of everything.
I think that's great. I think that's a great ending point for today. Maybe as a teaser for next time, Jem, what do you think we should tackle next time? I have in mind SMO2 max and fat max as how they relate. I've found a couple papers recently that here you go. Well, yeah, we can tease that.
There's a lot going on here, but just let your eyes glaze over.
Exactly. That's the teaser for next time. I'm really, really interested in that. I think it's really, I found some interesting papers. You probably saw them before me, where they talk about myoglobin saturation and the, essentially the affinity for fat transport and oxidation of oxygenated myoglobin versus deoxygenated myoglobin. I found a couple papers recently on that. Yeah. I'll send them to you then.
Please do.
But so next time we'll talk about blood lactate, fat max oxidation, and the relationship with SMO2. I think that's a good plan for next time. What do you think?
That sounds great. Yeah. There's, we've looked at one muscle. We can kind of expand the picture a bit now. We understand some of the parameters that we've looked at with the VL. Now we can look at other muscles. We can look at all the other measurements. Yeah, we'll start to expand the picture. I think that's a good idea. Man, that was a ton of fun. Just so if people want to learn more about you and what you do, where can they find you, Jem? Because I really appreciate you taking the time for those little detailed chats. They're beyond the chat. Like we're in a classroom here, guys. This is like university level shit. So I'm trying to practice my teaching.
You're doing great. You're doing fantastic. I hope I'm a good student. Jem,
the best.
Stop it. Where can people find out more about you, Jem?
I don't have much of an online presence. Like I don't post too much. Spare Cycles is my blog, which I post to seldomly these days because I'm busy with a PhD. But go on Spare Cycles. I think my email is up there. Like feel free to send me an email to reach out. I'm always happy to chat. Like I love talking about this stuff. So, and there's lots to talk about. And this is like practice for me to be able to explain it at all kinds of different levels. So if you're an expert pro, academic in this stuff, or if you're just a novice with your first NIRS Moxy sensor, either way, reach out. Feel free.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I'll put the info in the description of the video so people can reach out to you. Definitely check out his blog, folks. It's high quality stuff. And like I said, recently we did a podcast, Jem, you and I. So go check out this one. We talked about a lot of Moxy as well. And then a little bit earlier in the year, we did one with Jem and with Andrew from VO2 Master to talk about threshold. So 2 good resources for people who want to dig a little bit. Jem, thanks again. It was a lot of fun, man.
Thanks a lot, Sean. Appreciate it.